present in English again.
Я буду говорити англійською.
And the text will be available later, the English text.
Так, англійський текст буде доступний для всіх.
Before I go into this text, I ask for translating just a few, the first sentences.
Кілька вступних ремарок ми перекладемо, а тут на екрані буде українське резюме доповіді.
I'm going to speak to you as a reflective practitioner.
Я буду говорити до вас як практик, який ділиться своєю рефлексією.
This means that the practice is the point of departure of my paper.
Це означає, що практика це є відправна точка моєї доповіді.
It's the practice of supervising master's and doctoral research.
Це практика наукового керівництва магістерськими і кандидатськими дисертаціями.
It's also the practice of training supervisors.
Це також і практика підвищення кваліфікації самих наукових керівників.
So most of these people are doing empirical research in their studies.
Більшість цих людей займаються емпіричними дослідженнями.
So they engage in what we call the professional doctorate.
Всі вони залучені в те, що можна назвати професійним докторатом.
So through practical, praxis-related research, they are seeking truth, to use the phrase again I used in my word of greeting at the beginning. They are seeking truth to practical research.
Нав'язуючи до моїх вступних слів пошуку істини, отже, ці процеси є, власне, рефлексією, як через дослідження шукати істину.
So now I dive in my text and you can read the Ukrainian version here. Thank you for translating.
Тут від цього моменту можна слідкувати за моєю доповіддю тут праворуч на екрані.
This leads me into the topic of my paper. I'm going to speak about empirical research, assuming that this approach contributes to the search for truth. I'm convinced that empirical research has potential for the search for truth in theology, but I see also significant challenges. Both need to be identified and discussed. Already a first and quick look at recent developments in theological research shows empirical research has become common in theological studies, particularly in practical theology and missiology. Some universities even require empirical research in master's and doctoral research. This confronts students and supervisors with considerable challenges. Theologians are traditionally not well equipped to do empirical research. At the practical level, they often lack the skills, the methods they would need to conduct or supervise empirical investigations. But even more, an academically qualified and theologically sound engagement with the methodological issues behind the various instruments of empirical data collection is a rather new phenomenon. And many problems are not solved satisfactorily to this point, as far as I understand. All of this is not only challenging for students, it also puts high demands on supervisors who themselves often were not introduced to the methodologies and methods of empirical investigation in their traditional training as theologians. In what follows, I will concentrate on three issues. The first one is the questions, do researchers, students as well as supervisors, understand the methodological shift, sometimes called the empirical turn? The second one, do researchers, students as well as supervisors, master and apply the methods of empirical research properly? And the third one is, do researchers, students as well as supervisors, integrate empirical research and theology in a responsible way? From my experience, these are maybe the three major areas of concern I have. The first one, understanding the empirical turn. Just recently, and I always start with a short example, just recently a bachelor student approached me with a first idea for his bachelor thesis. The following question triggered his research interest. How can the gospel be good news for people in his generation in the context of Western Europe at the beginning of the 21st century? This is how the journey often begins, and in a first phase we help students to develop such preliminary ideas into an appropriate, researchable, and doable project. In this case, the student already had a quite clear idea. He proposed to exegete the passage in the Gospel of Mark that narrates Jesus' announcement of the kingdom of God as Euangelion, the good news. From this biblical study, he wants to derive the proper definition of the gospel and then apply it to the current context. He obviously wants to find out the truth with the purpose of communicating this truth into a given context. In my first conversation with him, I commended the student for his intended search for truth. The student unconsciously probably opted for a particular approach. He wanted to find out the true understanding of the gospel by studying a passage of the Bible disconnected from present realities in an apparently neutral space. Furthermore, he assumes that such a biblical study will give him the information needed to articulate a normative theological statement defining truth in the form of a proposition. Only after these first two actions, he intends to enter space and time in order to apply normative truth to his context. With this approach, the student is in good company. He follows a traditional research pattern which is based on at least three convictions. The first one, it is possible to enter a neutral space and to conduct research for truth disconnected from cultural, contextual, and situational realities. In other words, it is assumed that it is possible to take a God's eye point of view on a given subject. Secondly, the assumption is it is possible to articulate ahistorical normative truth claims, propositions that are independent from space and time. And thirdly, normative truth hits concrete contextual realities by way of application and communication. In other words, culture and context do not have any truth constituting power in this approach. We all know that this traditional approach has been challenged in the last century. Research has turned to the realities of life in order to find out how things really are. This paradigmatic shift has sometimes been called the empirical turn, and it has also reached theology. Some would call it a realistic turn to life in theology. And this not only at the level of application and communication, but as an essential dimension of the search for truth. Today, empirical research has become a standard practice in practical theology and mission studies. Empirical theology has developed into a discipline in its own right. Mission studies and insights from theologians in the non-Western world have intensified the pressure to look critically at some of the traditional epistemological convictions, especially the idea of decontextual, objective, and normative propositional theology. To give an example, in the discipline of missiology at the University of South Africa, UNISA, for which I also supervise, students enroll in the Master of Theology program are welcomed in the welcome letter with the following statement. I quote, "Our fundamental missiological approach is that of contextualization. This does not mean that we merely acknowledge the influence of context, upbringing, class, gender on people's views, but that we consciously integrate context analysis into theology. We can explain this further by saying that according to a contextual approach, there is no universally valid theology. An authentic theology arises from the particular context within which it is done. In a contextual approach to theology, a constant interplay between text and context is suggested." Over against this a textual source, there is the context or a real-life situation. In a contextual approach, text and context are constantly in a certain interplay, and so on. Contextual theology, still quotation, exposes the fallacy that theology has to do with timeless truth that can be expounded objectively. I'm not going to discuss this statement. I'm just saying UNISA encourages students to think in terms of what they call pastoral cycle. Some are familiar with the See, Judge, Act kind of cycle and other similar approaches. What are the consequences for the researcher and his or her supervisor? I have to show my bachelor student the potential of this turn to the life world of human subjects and to the implementation of a version of the See, Judge, Act methodological cycle. Without leading him away from studying the Bible, I have to show him that it's not against theological principles to open the eyes and to look carefully at the life experiences of human beings. This is precisely the way Jesus theologized, as Clement Sedmak puts it. As supervisor, I have to show the student what his intended top-down approach is based on certain assumptions, and that such as the superiority of ideas over against actions, the priority of theory over against practice, the notion of a God's eye perspective, or the assumption that contextualization is only a second step at the level of application and communication. At this point, I often refer to the concept of shared Christian practice developed by Thomas Groom in the context of religious education. And I skip this section now and go a bit further down. But I also have to be aware of the challenges inherent to such an approach. Critics normally see subjectivism and relativism as the key problems of empirical approaches to theology. There are critical issues, and any serious book on empirical theology needs to address the question how the Bible as the normative text of Christian theology can be related to context. It is revealing that the first Congress of the International Society of Empirical Research in Theology in 2002 addressed explicitly the topic empirical research and theological normativity, because this is one of the key issues we have to deal with. In my research seminars, I normally refer to the Austrian Catholic theologian Clement Sedmak, who outlines how the local, the global, and the universal can and must be related in the articulation of theology. He proposes a set of statements for a theological epistemology. I'm not going to read all 7 statements. I refer only to 3 of them. Number 3, theological epistemology cannot take place without explicit reference to the concept of revelation and with this to a theology of revelation. Or number 5, theological knowledge production is integrated in local contexts, and the two have to be remained in tension. Theological knowledge, the number 7, production cannot happen disconnected from the practice of faith. This means, the point is, as supervisors and researchers engage in inquiry that takes praxis as point of departure of the journey, employing methods of empirical research, they have to clarify what Sedmak calls a set of rules that will guide them at the methodological level. These guiding principles have to be reflected theologically. And I think Sedmak's set of principles provide a solid point of departure for such reflections. All of this I have put under the rubric understanding the empirical turn. This is the first challenge for students and supervisors engaging in empirical research in theology. Once we have clarified these meta-level issues, we come to the actual methods, how to carry out empirical research. Mastering, this is my second chapter, mastering research methods properly. A second example, a PhD student has been moving in his professional work into responsibility of academic leadership in a theological school in Germany. And he was confronted with the so-called Bologna process in European higher education and with all its philosophical, educational, economic, and practical implications. The often used slogan, fit for purpose, inspired him for his research project. And there is a critical comment going with it that the fit for purpose statement has to be qualified by a fit of purpose reflection. This finally led him into the direction of his study, and he came up with the research question, what is the purpose of theological education, and how does this affect theological education in the context of higher education in Europe? This student entered the adventure of doctoral research as a well-trained German theologian. He brought with him a solid knowledge of exegetical methods, of philosophical reasoning, of critical analysis of text. It was just natural that he would initially work with literature. The research problem led him into the history of theology in the context of the university, into the philosophy of education, and into theology of theological education. In the research modules, which are compulsory in his program, he learned more about the potential and the challenges of empirical research, including the basic issues I outlined in chapter 1. A new set of questions began to emerge. How are individuals in academic leadership actually responding to the paradigmatic changes initiated by the Bologna process? How do they respond theologically to the educational philosophical challenges that go with this paradigmatic shift? How do they define the purpose of theological studies in the context of academia in their particular situation? How do they cope with the challenges of accreditation processes in light of the economy-driven agenda of the Bologna enterprise? These are only a few questions that popped up in the conversations we had. As we developed the research project, the student felt the need to go out into the context and talk to people at the universities. And at this point, a proper research design was needed, and this required an in-depth knowledge of empirical research in theory and practice. However, this has not been part of this student's educational background so far, and this meant that additional training was needed. I refer only to the 3 areas we discuss normally in this context without elaborating on them. The first one is a methodological level. First of all, we have to talk about the meta level of empirical research. The student has to get acquainted with the difference of qualitative and quantitative research. He has to understand the difference between understanding and explaining. He has to be acquainted with deductive and inductive and abductive reasoning, and so on. As examiner, I observe occasionally the students follow the recommendations of their supervisors in the selection of the empirical method, but they do not understand the philosophical and epistemological background of the selected method. If a student, for instance, uses a phenomenological approach, he needs to familiarize himself with the philosophy of Edmund Husserl. If someone opts for grounded theory, he has to get acquainted with the roots of that approach. If researchers are not familiar with the background of the methods they are using, they are not in the position to make informed judgments about the explanatory power of their results. At this meta level, researchers also need to be introduced to the concept of the researcher as a subject, and to the knowledge constitutive interest, and talk and reflect on these issues. I skip the description on this again and go to my number 2, the methods. Once the methodological issues are clarified, the concrete research design has to be developed. It includes the selection of the appropriate methods. In order to do that, researchers have to be familiar with what can be called the repertoire of methods. And there's literature out there where you can learn it, but you have to learn it. Once the methods are defined, students have to acquire the skills and competences for the execution of the selected research methods. have to get acquainted with the appropriate instruments for data collection. They have to use this instrument accurately. Furthermore, they must be familiar with the data processing required in the framework of a particular method. In many cases, this includes the acquaintance with relevant software. All of this seems to be self-evident. I name it explicitly because theologians, researchers, and supervisors are quite often not trained in the field of empirical research. Training and tutoring is needed in order to ensure the required quality. And finally, students have to learn about conclusions. Researchers need to acquire the competences required to come up with appropriate conclusions, and again, I see 3 levels. First, the nature of the conclusion needs to be aligned with the chosen research methods. In general, quantitative studies have the potential to explain realities in such a way that reproducible principles and laws can be derived. Qualitative inquiries normally lead to the understanding of particular realities and do not yield reproducible principles. Do students know that? Do supervisors know that? Secondly, the explanatory power needs to be rated or judged appropriately. The researcher has to be familiar with the terms objectivity, validity, reliability, and he has to make a fair judgment with regard to the potential of his results. This also includes the awareness of the limitations of the results of his or her study. And thirdly, the researcher must be able to construct appropriate theories. Following Sedmak, I prefer the phrase the construction of theological models. His proposal takes into account that the particular nature of theological theories in comparison to the theories of other sciences. Based on abduction, quite often theology proposes models that include the dimension of revelation and faith, and the researcher needs to be aware of the potential and the limitations of such theories. So with this, I have outlined the methods level, the skills you need to do empirical research, and I come to my third part, integrating empirical research and theology. At the beginning of the 3rd chapter, again an example. Led by the conviction that one of the purposes of theological education is a holistic transformation of the students' lives, a doctoral researcher was interested in finding out how and to what extent such a transformation actually is taking place in evangelical theological colleges and seminaries in Europe. In this case, the student came with the background in education and with the basic knowledge in quantitative empirical research, including statistics, and quite soon it was clear that she wants to do a quantitative empirical investigation. The literature review revealed that another study on transforming learning in evangelical theological colleges in Europe had already been conducted, and that Csikszentmihalyi's theory of transformative learning may provide a valuable grid for the analysis of what the students wanted to do. We finally approved a proposal to do an online survey among students and faculty of evangelical theological colleges across Europe. Again, I'm not going to discuss the research project. I rather focus on one particular issue. Where and how does theology come into play? It is a general observation that empirical research in theology very quickly and very easily gets disconnected from theology. There are various reasons for that. Sometimes the argument is you cannot do everything in one study. To address related biblical and theological issues adequately seems often just too time and too space consuming so that the student decides to leave exegetical theological work aside. The empirical inquiry itself will take all the energy, the time, and the limited number of pages. But there are also reasons at a more serious level. Researchers may just not know how to integrate empirical research with theology. In their educational career, they have so far not been introduced to the more recent disciplines of empirical and contextual theology. and researchers, and occasionally also their supervisor, need training in these areas. By way of introduction, researchers should gain an understanding of various models and types of relating and integrating theology and empirical research. Based on this knowledge, they will be able to avoid some poor attempts to bring theology into play. I think of the bad habit to intersperse some biblical verses and simple theological claims here and there in the study. This is just not sufficient. Or the similarly poor praxis to have a substantial theological chapter, but completely disconnected from the rest of the dissertation. A serious integration of theology and empirical research requires more substantial reflection, and this is challenging. I want to point to two levels by distinguishing a dimensional level and an intentional level. The language dimension and intention I take from discussions in theology of mission. I apply it to empirical research. The dimensional side means everything has a theological dimension. And the intentional side emphasizes there are certain theological problems have to be solved. Let me begin with the intentional aspects. It may be a good point of departure in a study to have identified and clarified those key concepts which require theological reflection. In some cases, the key terms used in the title already reveal the themes that need theological clarification. An empirical study on spiritual formation in theological education needs to speak theologically to the concept of spirituality. A study which looks at some aspects of worship music empirically needs to address worship theologically. An empirical investigation of practiced discipleship in churches has to clarify the concept discipleship. So these are all topics I have had to deal with. However, in some cases, the relation to theology is not that obvious. The aforementioned study on transformative learning in theological education, utilizing Meserev's theory of transformative learning as basic theory for the analysis, makes no explicit reference to theology in the title. Transformative learning in theological education can be analyzed from a purely secular educational point of view. In this case, we have to ask more deeply how theology needs to come into play. Very quickly, in this case, it became evident that every educational theory is based on worldview, with worldviews which include a particular view of reality, a particular view of human beings, to name only a few aspects. This means that a theological study on transformative learning using Meserev will have to speak theologically to the underlying anthropology. The second level is the dimensional level. It is somewhat more complex to address the dimensional aspect properly. How can theology speak into every step of the research project? I tried to identify the task by referring to the three phases of a research process, sometimes called the context of discovery, the context of justification, and the context of application. Not going into debate about the three phases. Theological reflections in connection with the context of discovery. In my supervision, I also used the term context of clarification for this first phase of the process. The researcher needs to answer the why, what, and wherefore questions. He identifies a research problem, reflects his motivation, clarifies terms and concepts he uses, constitutes the researcher as a subject, articulates the knowledge-constitutive interest. These are not pre-scientific clarifications. At this stage, the key decisions will be taken, which determine the actual investigation in phase 2. Clear and transparent reasoning is required in this phase. Since the entire project is located in the field of Christian theology, everything to be clarified in this phase is already highly theological. In this context, again, I use some inspiration from Sedmak. He introduces the term context of faith. We are doing our research in the context of faith. He argues that the Christian theologian has to clarify his faith-based approach from the beginning, and he identifies 4 axiomatic statements. Christian theology has Jesus Christ at its center and foundation. Christian theology provides a religious reading of the universe. Christian theology implies epistemic commitments about the world, about God, about humanity, about life. Theology implies praxeological commitments. This means that the intended and supported conduct of life in community must be a quality standard for all theological scientific reasoning. I guess these are helpful questions to ask if we come to this part of a research project. With this in mind, I turn to the aforementioned example. As the student walks through phase 1, context of discovery or clarification, she has to think theologically about every step, and she had to clarify what is transformative learning theologically. If we come to the second phase, the so-called context of justification, she had to look more carefully at Jacques Mesurow's theory and the underlying philosophical issues and the methodologies she was using from a theological perspective. And finally, when it comes to application, or what sometimes is called the context of constructing theories, she had to be very clear theologically what would be the outcome in terms of the practice of church. I shortened this part a bit. So I summarized the 3rd chapter. One of the 3 major challenges of empirical research in theology is the question how theology comes into play, and I invited to look at 2 levels, the intentional level, where we focus on particular theological themes, and the dimensional level, where we think theologically across all phases of the research process. Researchers and supervisors need to be properly equipped for this demanding task. I summarize. We have explored the potential and the challenges of empirical research in theological education from a supervisor's perspective. I'm convinced that the potential of empirical research in theological education is immense. It brings theology down to earth. It enables theology to turn to life. It leads theology into cultures and context. It helps theology to move away from disconnected, ahistorical intellectual reasoning, and that embeds theological theory in practice. However, the challenges are not less immense. I have identified 3 major challenges: to understand and assess the so-called empirical turn properly, to master empirical research technically, methodologically, methods, and finally to integrate theology with empirical research. Thank you for your attention.